Hello everyone, welcome to the MudRoom, our weekly free Uncommon Sense parenting class. How is everyone today? It's the last week of August. This time next week it's going to be September. How crazy is that? I can't believe how fast this summer has gone. We're actually headed to our cottage next week for one last hurrah before school starts. My husband just got back from being away for most of the month, so that's always a relief for me, and we spent the last couple of weeks at my mom's house, who was gracious enough to host us, and that allowed us to visit with our friends in Ottawa and allowed the boys to participate in swimming lessons for the first time in 2 years with their friends, which was a huge thing for them. August was a good month, but freedom is so close that I can taste it. So we're going to ring it out with some time at the lake and some campfires and fishing, and I'm really looking forward to getting back there since we weren't able to spend any time there this month yet. I hope that you've got some plans for enjoying the last week of summer and the Labor Day weekend for those of us in North America too. It's hard to believe that things are finally going back to some semblance of normal. And with normal is going to come some decisions for a lot of families. If you've got little kids, I'm sure you've experienced the struggle over the last year of trying to balance working from home with your kids' care. And that struggle isn't over for a lot of us. With the Delta variant and many areas reducing safety protocols despite that threat, I'm hearing from a lot of parents that they're staring down the barrel of at least another 6 months before they can safely put their child back in daycare, preschool, or kindergarten. So I wanted to talk about the No Child Left Alone study that was done quite a while ago now. It was originally published in 2016, and the implications it's had for us over the last year and how it might affect us as we return to normal, and for those of us who aren't quite there yet. Before we get into it though, if you're new here, welcome. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Allana Robinson, and I'm a parenting coach for parents of toddlers, preschoolers, and kindergartners. I help you understand why your children are misbehaving and how to fix it without yelling, shaming, or timeouts. I'm your host here on the MudRoom. I'm also the host of the Parenting Posse Facebook group, and I'm the creator of the Parentability program where I help you raise well-behaved kids of your own. I've been featured on CTV News, Global News, and in today's Parent Magazine, among others, and I run these free classes every week to give you some nuggets of developmentally appropriate parenting wisdom to help you become the expert on your child that you want to be. If you're watching, say hi, let me know where you're joining us from. While you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you're listening to the podcast version, maybe even leave a review so that you never miss another class and we can get in front of more parents who need this information too. Okay, so let's get into it. So as I said, this No Child Left Alone study was published in 2016. And what it aimed to measure was how big of an impact our morality has on our risk assessment. So how much does what we believe to be right or wrong affect how risky we think something is? And they wanted to measure this specifically in the context of leaving children alone. The abstract of the study details the story of the Meitiv family. I think I'm pronouncing that right. M-E-I-T-I-V. Meitiv. I may be pronouncing it wrong though. I apologize if I am. And long story short, the 6 and 10-year-old children of the Meitiv family had been given permission to walk to their local park to play, and then they were picked up by the police on their way home because a quote-unquote concerned bystander called to report unsupervised children. This is very similar to the story of Kim Brooks that she details in her book Small Animals. And then the abstract goes on to explain that just one generation ago, leaving children unaccompanied was acceptable and normal, and they demonstrate that by talking about Roger Hart's project, where he went and he mapped where children were allowed to play in a small town in the UK in the 80s. And then 40 years later, he went back and tried to do it again, but most children weren't allowed out of their yards now, and most weren't even allowed without supervision. So what changed? What caused those parents who were the children roaming around unfettered 40 years before to now be the overprotective parents who wouldn't let their kids out of their sight? And their conclusion was that it was the availability heuristic. What is availability heuristic? Availability heuristic is a mechanism our brain uses to understand the safety of the world around us. Basically, the more frequently and recently you've experienced something, the more likely your brain is to think it will happen again. So in this case, in the 70s, you only ever heard about your local crime rate and the goings-on around your local context frequently. Occasionally, you'd get news in the newspaper or on the radio or TV about events outside your local context. So our brains made risk assessments based off of the local information that it heard frequently. But now, we hear more about the global context than our local context. And because we hear more about it frequently, much more frequently, because we have access to the internet and Facebook and podcasts and such, our brains make risk assessments based off of that global information. So a child is abducted in Texas, and a child is abducted in Dubai, and a child is abducted in Australia, and because we've heard of those 3 events in relatively short order, our brain goes, well, the chances of a child being abducted are actually quite high. It's not safe. When in reality, your local area hasn't experienced a child abduction in over 20 years. But we have this dynamic in a lot of areas. Travel accidents, house fires, school shootings, and yet none of those things result in parents being criminalized. Parents aren't criminalized for taking their kids on a plane with them, even though the chance of a plane crashing is much higher than them being abducted. Parents aren't criminalized for using fireplaces, even though the chance of your house going up like a box of tinder is much higher than a child abduction. Parents aren't criminalized for sending their kids to school despite the glut of school shootings in the US every year. So why are some objectively high-risk activities totally normalized, but others aren't? And that's because of moral coherence. Basically, we modify factual beliefs to fit our moral intuition. So if we think something is morally wrong, we will alter the facts to justify that moral judgment. If we think something is morally acceptable, we'll do the same thing. So how this study was conducted was that they created 6 scenarios using 6 imaginary children of 6 imaginary different ages. And they created vignettes of situations under which each child would be left alone. So like one 10-year-old child was being left alone asleep in a cool underground parking garage at a local gym. Another was a 2-year-old sitting at home eating a snack and watching the movie Frozen. So they created these scenarios and they read them to the participants. And they kept all the scenarios exactly the same. The only thing that they altered is the reason the parent was leaving their child in the scenario. So they had 5 different reasons for leaving the children that they rotated through: voluntary, unintentional, work, relaxation, and affair. So they read the scenarios and they were asked to rate the amount of risk in a situation from 1 to 10 based on the risk of the child being harmed. They then ran the same experiment, but instead of mothers leaving their child, it was a father leaving the child. And there were a few other variations that they ran as well. Basically what they discovered is that even if every other aspect of the scenario is identical, people will judge the risk of harm to a child as higher if they morally object to the reason the child is being left alone. So in the scenarios that ended with mom being hit by a car or stuck in traffic on her way home, the unintentional category, the participants universally rated the risk of harm as lower. In the scenarios that ended in mom leaving the kids to go meet a lover or to go to the spa, the relax and affair conditions, the participants universally assessed the risk as almost double. And for the more morally ambiguous ones, the volunteering and the work reasons, they assessed those to be somewhere in between. So what does this tell us? This tells us that we're not very good at assessing risk objectively as humans. When we assess risk, we're bringing in our availability heuristic as well as our moral feelings about whether we should be allowing our children out of our sight at all. And this is relevant right now because if you're still working from home, if you're still without care, if you're trying to figure out whether your child should take the bus home from school or whether you should drive them home from school even, you want to make sure that you're objectively assessing the actual risk to your child before you disallow it. Over the pandemic, so many of us have been killing ourselves trying to never let our kids out of our sight, doing everything for them, taking health precautions, even though they aren't necessarily all rooted in reality. And I'm guilty of this too, right? Like, I kept both my children home from school last year despite very low COVID numbers locally. However, that wasn't the only factor in me deciding to keep them out. I looked at those numbers and they were low. But I also looked at the mental health consequences of constantly changing learning environments, of shutdowns, and of the logistical disruption that would cause to our family. I looked at the risk of having to shut my parents out of our bubble, and I tried to make an objective decision based on those risks as well. I'm not entirely sure I succeeded, but knowing this information, I really tried to be objective. And I've heard so many parents who have been frustrated because they didn't feel that they could morally let their children out to play in their yard even while they worked, or they didn't feel that they could morally allow their child to be awake while they worked even. Because we've been fed so much out of date and subjective information on child development and attachment. So all of this is to say, I know many of us are in the middle of finalizing our decisions about September, and those decisions are going to look wildly different based on where you are and what the situation is locally to you. So please, for your sanity, try to filter out all of the international news and your personal moral feelings about the decisions and stick to the local facts while you're making those decisions. It will make the decisions much easier, and it will make them much more manageable, and it will make sure that you're making decisions that you aren't going to regret later because you based them off of smoke and mirrors instead of facts. So I hope that that gave you some food for thought and will make you pause next time you're denying your child an opportunity to consider where your denial is coming from. Is it from a moral judgment? Is it based on availability heuristic? Is it based on facts and your child's actual abilities? If you've got questions, please drop them in the comments and I'd be happy to answer them. If you'd like to continue the conversation, come find me in the Parenting Posse Facebook group and we can talk about it over there. The link is in the description. Thanks so much for joining me today. I will see you next week for another Uncommon Sense parenting class. Bye.